I have always been a failure. That's what my mother said, what my father said, what every well-meaning relative said, even the casual acquaintances I ran into at family gatherings. And for a long time, I believed them. I let their words define me, cage me, convince me that I was doomed to a life of mediocrity. I remember the day it began, the day I realized that no one, not even my family, would ever see me as capable or worthy. I was 28, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the city, working a soul-sucking job at a marketing firm that barely paid my rent. My life was a series of minor disasters neatly arranged to look like monotony. My parents had invested nothing in my education beyond a few $1,000s in tuition because, as my mother would say, "Why bother? You'll never amount to anything anyway." That phrase, "you'll never amount to anything," it clung to me like a shadow. It haunted me as I trudged to work each day, and it echoed in my mind every time I made a mistake or missed an opportunity. And there were plenty of mistakes. I lost jobs I should have excelled at. I failed at relationships, always choosing the wrong men, the ones who drained me or mocked me quietly. Even in small things like cooking a meal or maintaining friendships, I stumbled. But here's the truth. Failure is a teacher, a cruel one, but a teacher nonetheless. And I was a quick learner. I think the first time I truly felt the bitterness of my family's disdain was when my father called me one evening, his voice sharp and precise. "Emily, when are you going to get serious? Your cousin, Samantha, she's got a 6-figure job and a penthouse downtown. Look at you, still renting, still failing, still disappointing us all." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I just swallowed and said, "I'll figure it out, Dad." That lie has stayed with me for years. I didn't figure it out, not yet, but I started plotting. Not immediately, but slowly, calculatingly. I remember staring at the cracked ceiling of my apartment that night, thinking about my life, my failures, my family. And then I realized something terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I didn't need them to see my worth. I didn't need their approval. I needed power, and then I would make them see me, not as a failure, but as someone they should have feared. The first step was survival. I threw myself into my work, not for recognition, not for promotion, not for praise, but purely to learn. I watched people who were successful, who commanded respect, who wielded influence, and I dissected them. Their habits, their speech, their networks. Every interaction became a lesson. Every failure a blueprint. At the marketing firm, I was invisible, and that invisibility became my advantage. While my colleagues flaunted their small victories, I quietly absorbed knowledge. I learned how deals were made, how money flowed behind the scenes, how reputations were built and destroyed. By the time I left that job, not only had I amassed practical skills, I had also cultivated patience, a patience that would later serve as a weapon. But my family's scorn was relentless. They called often, each conversation a fresh wound. My mother's favorite tactic was guilt. "Emily, I don't know why you're so stubborn. Why can't you just settle down, marry well, and live a respectable life? Your sister would never treat us like this. She's smart, accomplished, everything you're not." Her words, intended to crush me, ignited a fire instead. I realized then that I didn't want their approval anymore. I wanted revenge. Not violent revenge, not petty acts of sabotage. I wanted to rise so high that my success would sting them in a way nothing else could. I wanted to show them that every word of ridicule, every dismissive glance, every calculated insult had been a mistake. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I had been laid off from my latest dead-end job, and I was broke, tired, and lonely. I sat in a cafe, nursing a black coffee, staring at my reflection in the window as the rain streaked down. It was in that reflection that I saw something unfamiliar: determination. I decided then that I would rebuild myself, not just for money or status, but as an instrument of poetic justice. I began by investing in myself, figuratively and literally. I enrolled in online courses, read voraciously, and practiced skills I had always ignored. I studied finance, entrepreneurship, marketing strategy, and human psychology. I didn't have the luxury of a mentor or a guiding hand, so I became my own. Money, I learned, was both the key and the lock. I started small freelance projects, consulting, side hustles. Each success was a brick in the foundation of my new life. And each failure was a stepping stone, carefully analyzed and used to improve. Meanwhile, my family continued their usual behavior. Invitations were withheld, subtle insults were thrown, and comparisons with my successful cousin were constant. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering was a reminder of how low I had fallen. And every slight fueled me. I didn't react outwardly. I smiled politely, nodded, and then retreated to the sanctuary of my growing empire. By the second year, I was no longer the woman they could ignore. I had launched a small digital marketing firm, and although it was not yet massive, it was profitable. I worked day and night, fueled by anger and ambition. The very skills they had mocked, my attention to detail, my analytical mind, my strategic thinking, became my most valuable assets. It was during this period that I began to see the patterns in my family's behavior. They believed success was a given, inherited, almost like a birthright. They mocked those who struggled, thinking that failure was permanent. I realized that if I played my cards right, their arrogance and complacency would be their undoing. I started networking quietly, building alliances with influential people, and observing opportunities that my family would never have imagined. Every meeting, every deal, every handshake was a small victory. Every day, I was growing stronger, smarter, more prepared. And yet, I maintained the facade of failure. When my parents called to belittle me, I allowed them their moment of triumph. I smiled, I nodded, I apologized for not being enough. Inside, I was laughing. I was a patient predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the third year, my firm was no longer a fledgling enterprise. We were handling high-profile clients, expanding into markets my parents would have scoffed at. I was becoming known in circles they had never accessed, speaking at conferences, featured in magazines, invited to exclusive events. And I was careful, so careful, that none of this was traceable to my family yet. The transformation was not just professional, it was personal. I had shed the insecurities that had once defined me. I walked taller, spoke with authority, and made decisions without hesitation. The fire of revenge had become a disciplined, controlled power. And I knew that the ultimate moment would come when I revealed to my family that the failure they had despised was now untouchable, untouchably successful, and in complete control of her destiny. But patience, I learned, is the hardest part. The sweetest revenge is not immediate. It is meticulously planned, executed with precision, and savored slowly. I would wait for the right occasion, the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my triumph. I would not merely tell them I had succeeded. I would show them, in a way that they could never ignore or belittle. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and the lights of my apartment glimmered like stars, I thought about my parents, about my mother's scornful voice, about my father's impatient disappointment. And I smiled, not because I had reached the peak yet, but because I had begun the ascent. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and mocked me. They had built me a ladder of ridicule, and I had climbed it, step by step, turning every insult into a rung that raised me higher. I am Emily, the daughter who was told she would never succeed. I am Emily, the woman who took every failure, every slight, every cruel word, and forged them into strength. And I am Emily, the patient architect of a revenge that will be as unstoppable as it is inevitable. This is only the beginning. By the time I decided to act, the world outside my apartment had already begun to recognize my name. My firm had grown faster than I dared imagine, and with growth came attention. But this attention was nothing compared to what I had been cultivating quietly. Leverage. I had learned the rules of influence, the subtle power of networks, and the quiet art of making people owe you favors. Every deal I signed, every client I retained, every new partnership I formed was not just a step forward in business. It was a potential weapon against the family who had laughed at me for years. I remember the first time I felt the thrill of real control. It was at a charity gala, the kind my parents had always attended without fail, flaunting their wealth and connections. This time, I was there not as an awkward daughter or a failure to be whispered about behind closed doors. I was there as Emily Grant, the woman whose firm was responsible for the branding and publicity of several high-profile philanthropists.
People noticed me. People respected me.
I walked in wearing a simple black gown, my hair swept into an elegant bun, and a smile that was calm, knowing, and utterly dangerous. I saw them across the room almost immediately. My mother, in a glimmering dress that seemed to demand attention, laughing with relatives I barely knew. My father, looking self-satisfied as he exchanged greetings with prominent businessmen. And yes, my sister Samantha, radiant and smug, the golden child who had never once doubted her place in the world. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember all the moments they had mocked me, the Christmases where my accomplishments were ignored, the family gatherings where every word out of my mouth was twisted into evidence of my inadequacy, the endless comparisons to Samantha. And then, just as quickly, I let it go. Revenge, I had learned, was most effective when precise, calculated, and invisible until it struck.
I didn't approach them that night.
Not yet. I circulated, spoke with key players in my industry, laughed at carefully placed jokes, and slowly built the impression of someone untouchable, someone successful enough that their whispers would mean nothing. I wasn't there to confront. I was there to observe, to prepare, to plant seeds that would grow into the instruments of my eventual triumph. It started small. A contract here, a recommendation there. My parents, proud of themselves and unaware of my growing influence, began to rely on people I had already subtly manipulated. A cousin needing assistance with a minor business deal? My firm provided the solutions. An old family friend seeking a high-profile media placement? I made it happen, quietly ensuring that my parents received credit for being connected, while I remained the invisible hand behind every success. Each interaction was a lesson in patience and precision. I discovered that the most powerful form of revenge was not humiliation, but invisibility paired with control. I could influence their lives, their status, their perception, without ever revealing my direct involvement. Every success I engineered, every problem I solved, I did so in the shadows, watching as they basked in the glory, unaware of who was truly pulling the strings. Of course, I didn't entirely conceal myself. I allowed a few hints, subtle reminders that I was no longer the failure they had dismissed. At one event, a journalist approached me, asking for my opinion on a new marketing strategy. I answered with calm authority, citing data, trends, and innovative tactics. My parents, observing from across the room, stiffened as they realized the woman they had written off was now a recognized expert in her field. My mother's smile faltered ever so slightly, my father's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. And Samantha looked almost shocked. I could see it in her eyes. The beginning of doubt, the first crack in her belief that success was automatic, inherited. That moment gave me a thrill I had never known before. Not because I enjoyed her discomfort, but because it proved my method was working. Subtlety, patience, invisibility. These were the tools of my revenge. And the first strike had been successful. But I didn't stop there. Revenge, like success, required escalation. I began to manipulate situations that would expose my family's complacency, their arrogance, and their reliance on outdated methods. I introduced them to contacts who appeared invaluable but were actually carefully chosen to highlight their inefficiency. I offered guidance in ways that made them dependent on my insight, without ever appearing to assert dominance. I watched quietly as my parents, accustomed to control, began to seek my advice. The first time my father called me for assistance was a turning point. I was expecting it, having laid the groundwork for months. "Emily," he said, his voice cautious yet tinged with disbelief, "I hear you've been doing some remarkable work with Henderson Corporation. I could use your advice on a project we're handling." I smiled at my phone, alone in my apartment, savoring the moment. "Of course, Dad. I'd be happy to help," I replied smoothly. "Why don't we schedule a call tomorrow to go over the details?" The next day, I provided advice that was perfectly correct, impeccably timed, and subtly designed to highlight my parents' prior misjudgments. I knew they would take credit publicly, yet privately, they were reliant on me. Every conversation reinforced their dependence, and every dependence became leverage for the future. Samantha, ever competitive, began to notice the change in family dynamics. She called me one evening, her tone cordial but cautious. "Emily," she said, "I've been hearing interesting things about your firm. I didn't realize you had grown so quickly. Maybe we should talk sometime, collaborate even." I laughed softly, letting the sound carry just enough warmth to keep her unaware of my amusement. "Of course, Sam. I'd love to discuss ideas. Let's find a time." Behind that seemingly innocent offer was a trap. I began to share insights that appeared generous, but subtly undermined her strategies, guiding her to make minor missteps that only I could correct. Every correction further cemented my importance, my control, my invisible dominance. Samantha was unaware that with each favor I provided, I was tightening the noose of my eventual revenge. Meanwhile, I was careful to maintain appearances in the social sphere. I attended galas, fundraisers, and elite gatherings, always smiling, always calm, always composed. I was the woman who had turned herself around, the daughter who had proven everyone wrong. And yet, no one suspected the extent of the strategy behind my moves. The more subtle my influence, the more profound the effect. By the end of the first year of my campaign, the family dynamic had shifted dramatically. My parents began to consult me regularly. My sister grew increasingly dependent on my expertise, and I maintained the perfect veneer of gracious success. Every conversation, every interaction, every decision they made was now subtly guided by me. I reveled in the quiet power I wielded. This was not about money or fame or even ego. This was about justice, the poetic, meticulously orchestrated justice of proving that their disdain had been both blind and foolish. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, mocked me. And now, I was the unseen hand controlling the outcomes they prized most. And yet I was only beginning. This was the first strike, the opening move in a larger game that would ultimately expose every insult, every slight, and every act of condescension they had ever directed at me. I had tasted the thrill of influence, of control, of strategic power. And it was intoxicating. Late at night, I often sat in my office, reviewing the day's interactions, analyzing the outcomes, and planning the next moves. My revenge was not about humiliation. It was about undeniable supremacy. I wanted my family to look back, years from now, and realize that the daughter they had called a failure had risen far above them, not through luck, not through inheritance, but through deliberate, calculated effort. The first strike had been a resounding success, and I knew the next moves would need to be even more subtle, more strategic, and more effective. I had begun the ascent from failure to fortune, and every day, every interaction, every calculated maneuver brought me closer to the ultimate triumph. And as I locked my office for the night, turning off the lights and stepping into the quiet streets of the city, I smiled to myself. Patience had paid off. Influence had begun to bloom. And the family who had dismissed me, the family who had mocked me, had no idea what was coming. I was Emily Grant, once a failure, now an architect of fortunes and fates, quietly plotting the downfall of those who had never believed in me. And this was only the beginning. By the time I reached my 31st birthday, the transformation was undeniable, not just to the world, but to myself. I no longer recognized the woman I had been, the one who trembled at a phone call from my parents, who flinched at every judgment, who doubted her own abilities. That Emily was gone. In her place stood someone deliberate, disciplined, and unrelentingly strategic. The thrill of influence had become almost intoxicating. I was no longer content to operate behind the scenes. Subtlety had been my weapon in the beginning, but now I craved results that could not be ignored, consequences my family would feel viscerally. The first strike had been gentle, a demonstration of capability. The second strike had established influence. Now it was time for the third, exposure. It began with Samantha. My sister, once radiant with confidence, had started leaning on me in ways that were almost comical. She trusted my guidance completely, seeking advice on projects, investments, and networking events. And I gave it, carefully, strategically, with every word calibrated to ensure small failures, minor embarrassments, that only I could correct. I watched her stumble over seemingly trivial mistakes, watched her credibility erode in subtle but public ways. Every falter, every hesitation, every misstep was a thread I was weaving into the larger web. I remember one particular evening vividly. Samantha had been scheduled to give a presentation to a group of influential investors. She had called me the day before, desperate for guidance, clearly panicked. "Emily," she said, her voice tight, "I don't know what to do. I've never spoken in front of such a big crowd. I'm going to ruin everything." I smiled softly, letting my tone convey empathy, without mercy. "You won't," I said. "But let's review your slides together. I'll point out a few adjustments that could make all the difference." The adjustments were subtle, reordered bullet points, minor data tweaks, but they were enough to throw off her pacing, enough to make her second-guess herself during the presentation. I didn't intervene publicly. I let the scene unfold naturally. And unfold it did. Samantha's presentation went poorly. Not disastrously, but poorly enough that whispers began circulating among the investors. Small mistakes, awkward phrasing, a momentary loss of confidence. They noted it, filed it away, and moved on, but the damage was done. Later, she called me in a panic. "Emily," she said, voice trembling, "I don't understand. I prepared, I thought I was ready. I don't know what happened." I let a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escape me. "You were nervous, Sam. It happens to the best of us," I said. "We'll practice more next time. You'll be flawless." Flawless. I liked that word. It reminded me that the facade of success is fragile, and I held the keys. Meanwhile, my parents remained blissfully unaware of the orchestration behind the scenes. My father had begun to consult me on personal investments, seeking guidance on properties and ventures. I provided advice, correct, profitable, but always structured to highlight their previous errors, always in ways that made them dependent on me. My mother, ever the socialite, had begun attending events where my influence ensured that she would be noticed, but only because I orchestrated it. She believed it was her charm, her presence. Little did she know it was my planning that amplified her visibility, creating the illusion of competence while tightening the web around her pride. The real thrill, however, came when I began to extend my reach beyond family dynamics into public exposure. I wanted their arrogance, their entitlement, to be challenged in a space where it could not be ignored. And so I carefully leaked information, created situations where their reliance on my expertise would be revealed indirectly, and orchestrated minor embarrassments that made them appear outdated, inefficient, and dependent on the very daughter they had scorned. One evening, I attended a networking dinner where several key business contacts of my parents were present. I had spent weeks arranging this opportunity, planting seeds of curiosity about my firm, subtly drawing attention to my projects. As my parents arrived, the contrast was immediately apparent. Their old connections, their established social circles, were now seeing a woman who had quietly become indispensable to multiple ventures. My mother smiled, waving gracefully, unaware of the whispers circulating around her. "Isn't that Emily Grant? I hear her firm managed the Thompson merger flawlessly." I let the comment linger, invisible yet palpable. My parents noticed the reaction, but could not trace it to me. They basked in the social validation, completely unaware that I had engineered it. The satisfaction was exquisite. They were now publicly relying on me, and they didn't even know it. Samantha, desperate to maintain her own status, began seeking me out more frequently. She wanted mentorship, advice, validation. I provided it selectively, revealing solutions while subtly causing new complications that would further cement her dependence. Each interaction, each moment of uncertainty on her part, strengthened the foundation of my revenge. Yet I was careful not to appear vindictive. I maintained the persona of the successful, gracious daughter. People admired me, envied me, and trusted me. My family believed I had merely turned my life around through hard work, resilience, and talent. And in a way, that was true, but only half the truth. The other half, the crucial half, was control. Every relationship I nurtured, every deal I executed, every decision I influenced brought me closer to the ultimate revelation. The day when my family would understand that the failure they had dismissed had become the force that now defined their successes and failures alike. By the end of that year, my firm had doubled in size. My influence had expanded into circles my parents had always coveted, and my web of subtle manipulation was tightening. I had become indispensable to the very people who had once dismissed me, my power invisible but undeniable. And still, I waited. Revenge, I had learned, is not about speed, it is about timing. Every move I made, every interaction I orchestrated, every subtle correction and strategic suggestion was designed to culminate in a moment when my family could no longer ignore me. When they finally saw that the daughter they had mocked, the woman they had scorned, was not only successful but indispensable, and that all of their pride, all of their condescension, had only served to elevate me further. Late at night, I often reflected on how far I had come. The fear, the self-doubt, the endless reminders of my inadequacy, all of it had fueled my ascent. I had learned to convert every insult into a stepping stone, every failure into leverage, every slight into strategy. And as I sat in my office, overlooking the city lights that flickered like distant stars, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The web was tightening. The pieces were moving into place. And soon, very soon, the family who had dismissed me would have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Emily Grant, once a failure, was now a force they could neither control nor ignore. And this was only the beginning. The air was different that morning. Crisp, electric, charged with anticipation. I had spent years planning, years quietly building influence and shaping outcomes behind the scenes, and now the moment had arrived. The culmination of patience, strategy, and subtle manipulation was ready to reveal itself in full. I sat in my office, overlooking the city skyline, reviewing the final pieces of the plan. The contracts were signed, the media placements were scheduled, and the invitations had gone out to every key player who mattered, my family included. Everything had been orchestrated so meticulously that they had no inkling of the role I had played in their own reputations and fortunes. It began with Samantha. My sister, the golden child, had grown increasingly dependent on me without realizing it. Every misstep, every minor embarrassment I had orchestrated, had driven her into my orbit. Now, I arranged for her to attend a high-profile investor gala where I knew she would be unprepared. The moment she arrived, I noticed the subtle signs of panic, the quick adjustments of her dress, the tense smile, the slight hesitation in her steps. I had ensured that a critical presentation she had prepared would be publicly scrutinized, her data slightly outdated, her projections technically inaccurate, all seemingly minor, but enough to draw attention from sharp-eyed investors. As she stumbled through her introduction, I watched from the back of the room, calm and composed, invisible yet omnipresent. Whispers began to circulate. "Isn't that Emily Grant's sister? I hear Emily's firm has been advising her projects." By the time Samantha realized the investors were comparing her projections with my meticulously prepared reports, it was too late. Her credibility faltered, and the subtle shame in her eyes as she glanced around the room was almost delicious. Not out of malice. I had never loved malice, but out of the perfect justice of precision, patience, and timing. Next, my parents. They had long relied on my counsel, unknowingly dependent on me for the image of their competence. I had arranged for a series of strategic interviews with business journals, highlighting the projects my parents had publicly managed, but subtly hinting at the expertise behind them. By the time the feature went live, the world would see what I had always known. My parents' successes were largely the product of my intellect, my strategy, and my relentless effort. They would be forced to acknowledge, publicly and privately, that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had not only risen above them, but had orchestrated their fortunes without their knowledge. The invitations arrived at the family home the night before the final gala, elegantly printed with my firm's branding. My mother, ever the socialite, was thrilled at the prestige of the event. She had no idea that attending would reveal her own dependency and complacency. My father, always proud, believed this was a chance to showcase their family achievements. And Samantha, nervous and unprepared, would be publicly exposed. The evening of the gala arrived. I entered, poised, confident, radiating the calm authority I had cultivated for years. My parents and sister arrived shortly after, unaware that the room's attention had already begun to shift toward me. Every handshake, every introduction, every subtle glance confirmed my dominance. The whispers were subtle at first, then more insistent. Emily Grant? She's the one behind the recent successful mergers, the campaigns that everyone is praising, the projects that everyone assumed were managed by her family. The realization hit them slowly, painfully, like ice in the chest. My mother's smile faltered. My father's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in dawning comprehension. Samantha's jaw tightened as the truth became undeniable. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and undervalued was the invisible force driving their reputations. I approached them, smiling politely. "Mother, father," I said softly, "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. I hope you're enjoying the evening." Their stammered responses, the slight flush of embarrassment, the hesitation in their eyes, it was a symphony I had composed. I continued, calm, deliberate. "I've worked hard to build something meaningful. I'm proud of the work I've done, and I'm grateful for your encouragement over the years." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, their implied meaning sharp, unspoken. "You underestimated me. You mocked me. And now you see who I really am." Samantha tried to speak, to assert herself, but the words faltered. Her carefully cultivated facade of competence crumbled as the room's attention remained firmly on me. My parents, too proud to confront me directly, could only offer polite, strained smiles, realizing for the first time that their daughter, the one they had considered a failure, was untouchable, unstoppable, and in full control of her destiny. The public recognition was not enough. I had to ensure that every private slight, every insult, every dismissal over the years was acknowledged, if not verbally, then through the undeniable truth of my success. I orchestrated a series of subtle acknowledgments, articles, interviews, event appearances, where my contributions could not be ignored. By the end of the evening, the family who had dismissed me had no choice but to see the truth. Emily Grant, once a failure, was now a force that defined their successes and their social standing. Later that night, after the gala, I returned to my apartment, alone but triumphant. I allowed myself a moment to reflect, to savor the culmination of years of patient planning. My revenge was complete, not through malice, not through petty humiliation, but through undeniable, tangible superiority. I had transformed failure into fortune, doubt into respect, invisibility into influence. I thought of every insult, every dismissive comment, every family gathering where I had been made to feel small. And I smiled, quietly, with satisfaction. Justice had been served, not loudly, not destructively, but perfectly, methodically, elegantly. I am Emily Grant. I am the daughter they called a failure. I am the woman they dismissed, mocked, and underestimated. And now, I am the force they cannot ignore, the power they cannot challenge, the success they cannot deny. Revenge, I learned, is not about anger. It is about patience, strategy, and the quiet satisfaction of watching truth reveal itself. And in that moment, I felt complete, fulfilled, and finally free. The daughter, who had once been powerless, had risen. The daughter who had been mocked, underestimated, and scorned had triumphed. The daughter who had been a failure had become an empire unto herself. And with that, the story of Emily Grant, from failure to fortune, from scorn to triumph, was complete.